Well, one of the things, when we look back at the First World War, I think at this point, most of us would agree that if there was any one single event in the 20th century that we could reach back and magically undo, wouldn't it be the War of 1914 to 1918? Not only did it produce a colossal death toll, but it left behind a legacy of bitterness and resentment in Germany that Hitler was able to manipulate so cleverly to gain power and start an even more destructive war in the Holocaust as well. I think it's impossible to imagine the Second World War happening without the First. Well, at the time it was happening, 1914 to 1918, there were in all of the warring countries extraordinary people who saw what was happening as madness and who often refused to fight if they were young men eligible for the military, or who supported those who refused to fight. Emma Goldman, as I mentioned, was sent to jail for organizing against the draft and speaking out very strongly against the war. Eugene Debs, the great labor leader, spoke out against the war after the United States entered it, and for that he was sentenced to prison. And he was still in prison in November of 1920 when he received nearly 1 million votes for president on the Socialist Party ticket, being able to campaign only from his prison cell. Jane Addams, the pioneer social worker, also was a strong opponent of the war, and she took part in a remarkable conference of women from warring countries on both sides and from neutral nations who met in The Hague in neutral Holland in 1915 to try to talk about ways of making peace. And the photographs from that conference are one of the few places, if not the only place, where during those 4.5 years you can see people from both sides embracing each other, talking together, trying to figure out how to stop this horrible conflict. There were brave war resistors in every other country. In France, for example, someone I hope they have been honoring this past week, although I haven't seen anything about it, is the great French socialist leader Jean Jaurès, who in 1914 spoke out very strongly against this war he saw looming, saw it coming. A week before it started, he rushed to Brussels for an emergency conference of the leaders of Europe's left-wing parties. Before an enormous crowd in a plaza there, he put his arm around the leader of the German Social Democrats and said, our people will never make war on each other. Because of that, 3 days later, after he had gone back to France, he was assassinated. 3 days after that, the war began. His assassin, incidentally, was found innocent at his trial because the crime was judged to be, quotes, a crime of passion. A legal gimmick that usually lets men get away with murdering women, but in this case it was put to a different use. There were more than 6,000 people in England, young men in England who were eligible for the draft, who refused it and who were sent to prison because of that. There were war resistors in Germany, like Rosa Luxemburg, the great democratically minded socialist, sent to prison for her opposition to the war. More such people in Russia. So from all of these countries, I think these are the people, as well as the veterans, who should be honored at